The Council Chamber doors are not built to fail. For centuries, on a planet at the center of galactic civilization, those doors had separated the Jedi Order's leadership from everything else, and the Order had stopped imagining the day they would not hold. In the novel The Old Republic, Deceived, by Paul S. Kemp, that day arrives. A figure in dark armor moves through the Jedi Temple on Coruscant with an intent that is not improvised. He does not stop at the entrance or pause to take in the building. The novel describes the destruction of the Sith Empire's campaign as carried out in his wake. The violence does not surround him or carry him forward. It follows him because he's the source. His name is Darth Malgus. The Jedi Council that meets above him does not know it yet, but the figure climbing towards them is not like the Sith they have spent generations preparing for. Something about him does not fit the way those Sith were supposed to behave. When that day is over, the council that walks out will no longer trust what it knows, and the unease that begins inside the temple will stay with the Order for the rest of his lifetime. Thousands of years from this moment, long after the Republic he's about to break has reformed and fallen again, two of the most powerful Sith in galactic history will still keep a text written by the man inside their building on their shelves. According to the Legends reference book, Book of Sith, a collection assembled by Darth Sidious, one of the included works is a text by Darth Malgus, and the same volume is later annotated by Darth Vader. Inside the temple, one detail had not yet registered. The Sith walking towards the council was not behaving like a Sith. The Jedi have been hunting Sith for generations. The Star Wars The Old Republic historian Nostaral records that the council had even ordered him to revise the Order's historical records and trace the conflict with the Sith back to its roots. That kind of long memory was the Order's pride. It meant a Jedi Master meeting a new Sith threat could compare what they were seeing against centuries of patterns the Order had already studied, and most of the time, the new Sith fits somewhere inside those patterns. A rage-driven Sith looked one way, and a court politician Sith looked at another. The Order had a category for both, and weaknesses to read in each. The figure in the temple does not fit either profile. The Jedi inside the building during the sacking are not facing a berserker losing control. They're not facing a court climber striking at a rival. They're facing a commander, methodical, in his place at the front of the violence rather than carried along by it. Soldiers move around him with a discipline that is not the Imperial standard. Some of them are not even from species the Empire trusts. That last detail, easy to miss in the noise of the assault, is the first crack in the Jedi's profile of him. The official Old Republic record of him says it plainly. He employed mercenaries drawn from species long considered untrustworthy by Imperial custom. Imperial doctrine treated whole populations as unreliable in principle, and most Sith of his rank accepted those prejudices without question. He did not. The fighters in the temple that day included people the rest of the Empire would never have armed. That detail alone would later tell the Order something. Sith who go against Imperial doctrine on a question that is fundamental are not Sith working their way up a ladder. They're Sith building their own thing, and they've already decided the ladder is in the way. The Jedi do not have time to study him that day. The temple falls, and the Order survives. The figure in the dark armor leaves Coruscant alive, and the Republic, in what the Star Wars The Old Republic galactic history entry on the Treaty of Coruscant calls a peace agreement unprecedented in Republic history, signs the deal. The Republic does not want it, and the records are direct about that. The same Star Wars The Old Republic material adds that the Jedi Council urged caution when the Senate considered the Sith offer, and even the Council had to admit the war had become unwinnable. That is the first thing he takes from the Order, their voice. The Jedi who had served the Republic for millennia are now the ones in the chamber telling the senators to step back. They feel the change before they can name it. The quiet fear that the Sith who had reached the temple had also reached the part of them that used to know what to say. The masters who had once carried the Republic's hardest decisions through the Senate floor now spoke in shorter sentences and gave way faster, because the certainty that had once carried them into the room had not walked in with them. The treaty is signed, the war ends, and the Sith who had shaped both walks out of Coruscant alive with years of work ahead of him that nobody is yet equipped to watch. The Old Republic record of his career picks up the story. He leads military expeditions into the unknown regions after the war, expanding the Empire's influence through that work. In the Old Republic era, the unknown regions are the uncharted edge of the galaxy, a zone where star maps run out and where no major power holds firm control. The Jedi have intelligence networks across the galaxy. They do not have them out there, and for years, that is where he goes. The fear that grows inside the Order during these years is not the fear of a Sith they can find, it is the fear of a Sith they cannot, and the Jedi had never had to live with that kind of fear from any Sith before him. The choice was a rejection of every path Sith of his rank were supposed to take. The campaigns are slow, the political capital is harder to claim from a Senate that does not know where the territory is. A Sith who wants to climb the Imperial Pyramid spends those years in the capital, attending court functions, cultivating dark counselors, trading favors, managing apprentices. Armies come through assignment, and titles come through patronage. Removing a Sith of his rank from the hierarchy is often as simple as removing the patron above him. He refuses all of it. The official record of his career shows no patron, no faction, and no steady court presence around him after the treaty. His support base comes from those unknown regions campaigns, not from court alliances. The soldiers under his command have not been assigned to him by a court order. They follow him because they followed him into places nobody else was willing to go. The same record notes, almost in passing, that he personally learns dozens of languages. That detail is strange when read alone, because a rage-driven Sith does not sit still long enough to learn dozens of languages. That kind of work takes years. It is the work of someone who plans to govern populations, not just break them. When the Jedi tried to map him the way they always had, looking for a patron, a political circle, or an apprentice chain, they found that none of those connections existed in any form they could follow. There was no relationship to pressure, no faction to infiltrate, and no pattern that could tell them what he would do next. The file they built on him gave them nothing to hold on to. The mercenaries under his command did not appear in Imperial records the way regular Sith forces would, and the territory he operated in did not exist on the Order's maps. Over time, that absence began to change how the Order spoke about him. Briefings stopped ending with conclusions and began to focus on contingencies, on what the Order might do if he moved next, and how little of that they could actually control. Somewhere during those same years, he was also writing. The Order did not know that yet, and the Empire did not know it either, but the text Sidious would one day collect was already taking shape, and the Sith who was writing it had stopped thinking of himself as Imperial. The next time the Emperor heard from him publicly, he was no longer serving it. The revolt, when it came, was not a court intrigue. A later Star Wars The Old Republic storyline historical recap describes him as long dissatisfied with Imperial backstabbing and political maneuvering, and as eventually leading a revolt of his own, aiming to seize control of the Sith Empire. He believed Imperial politics was weakening the Sith cause. He believed internal betrayals wasted energy that should have been aimed outward. He had said none of this loudly enough for the court to register it as a threat. The strange part is what came before. The Empire had spent decades with him in plain view. The Sacking of Coruscant was on his record, and the Unknown Regions campaigns were in the Imperial files. The mercenaries, the languages, the absence of patronage, all of it was on paper. None of it had alarmed the people the Empire trusted to watch for ambitious Sith. In Imperial offices, his file was kept on a desk that handled minor warlords, because there was no court intrigue to track. In Jedi briefings, his name came up less often each year, because there was no faction movement to report. Both institutions had quietly decided he was no longer the priority he had been, and both were wrong. The Imperial Court ran on the assumption that ambitious Sith expressed their ambition inside it. A Sith with no court footprint was, by the Empire's own logic, a Sith with no ambition worth watching. That assumption was wrong. The court had no framework for someone whose ambition operated outside the framework entirely. When the revolt arrives, the Star Wars The Old Republic storyline record describes it as an open move. He gathers the forces he had built during his years in the Unknown Regions, the same kind of troops and mercenaries documented in his record, and turns them toward the existing Imperial leadership. The revolt is not a cabal trying to replace one Dark Counselor with another. It is a direct challenge to the shape of the Empire itself, launched by a commander who already has an army that answers to him personally before the first shot is fired. For the Jedi watching the news come in, the revolt confirms something they had been afraid of without proof for years. That the Sith they could not see had been preparing on a scale the Order had no vocabulary for. Inside the Jedi Order, the pieces finally clicked together. The Masters who had spent years trying to read him as one kind of Sith now understood, all at once, that they had been reading the wrong book. The fear they had been carrying without a name became a fear they could finally see. It was worse named. From that day, Council decisions came slower. Every assessment of a Sith threat now had to pass through masters who knew their last reading had been wrong, and the certainty that it once carried Jedi into Republic chambers did not come back. The Council had been carrying questions about him since the sacking. The pieces had been there for years, but the frame had not been there to fit them. The revolt provides the frame. The Jedi had not been looking at a Sith warlord building his own career, they'd been looking at a Sith quietly building his own replacement for the entire Imperial system. Other Sith who resented Imperial weakness had spent their careers inside the system they wanted to change, which meant every move they made could be traced through their own networks and blocked. Malgus had given the Empire no thread to pull on him. He had given the Jedi no threat either. Late in his career, both institutions finally understood what he was. They also understood, at the same moment, that they had been late to understand him for the entire time he had been alive. Even that late understanding was not the end of the problem, and the revolt did not end his story. The Old Republic record of him covers his continuing campaigns into the unknown regions, years of them. The later Star Wars The Old Republic storyline material places the revolt as a separate major event. Later, the Old Republic story pages describe him pursuing an unknown plan inside storylines that come later still. A Republic that hopes to close the file on him keeps finding the file does not close. The sources never call him unbeatable, they describe something more dangerous than that. He is defeatable in combat, and his plans can be opposed. What he has instead is durability. A Republic that wins a fight against him in one era finds him operating under different rules in the next, and nothing they learned in the previous phase fully carries forward. For Jedi intelligence teams trying to keep a profile current, every read on him kept going stale. A Jedi analyst could close a file on him at the end of one decade and find, opening it in the next, that the figure inside it had moved past every assumption the file was built on. The sacking gave the Order a Sith who could reach the Temple, and they prepared for that. The Unknown Regions years gave them a Sith who could operate beyond their maps, and they prepared for that. The Revolt gave them a Sith who could split the Empire from inside, and they prepared for that. The later storylines gave them a Sith pursuing an unknown plan that nobody had a vocabulary for yet, and they understood, finally, that whatever they prepared for would be the wrong thing again. Most Sith of the era are understood inside a single arc, and then shelved. He kept forcing new understandings every time anyone thought they had him figured out, and during all of this, the writing he had started somewhere in the Unknown Regions years was still in the world. Thousands of years passed, and the Republic he broke reforms and fell again. The Sith Empire that produced him collapses long before his name leaves official record. New Sith rise, new Jedi rise, whole eras pass between his lifetime and the next time the galaxy will be ruled from the chair he had once tried to take. Eventually, in a private collection assembled by the Sith Lord, who had just won that chair, a text by Darth Malgus is filed alongside writings from other Sith deemed worth preserving. The collector is Darth Sidious. The collection is the volume identified in Legends as Book of Sith, and Sidious selects what goes into it. Later, that same volume is annotated by Darth Vader. These two figures are not casual readers. They are the most powerful Sith in galactic history. Sidious will rule the galaxy, and Vader will enforce that rule. Their attention is finite, and the things that hold it tend to be the things they consider worth their attention. The fact that a Sith from the Old Republic, dead for thousands of years by then, is on that shelf is the kind of detail that ought to be impossible. What exactly Malgus put into that text, the sources do not fully say, but his career points at the kind of thinking Sidious and Vader were reading. The Sith philosophy of Malgus' era was dominated by the internal games of the Imperial Court, by lineage and patronage, by Sith who defined themselves through the system around them. Malgus built his life against that grain. He had hired outside Imperial prejudice. He had expanded into territory the Empire's own maps did not cover. He had led through combat rather than through court rank. He had revolted against the Empire that produced him when he judged it no longer worth serving. Whatever went into his Book of Sith texts almost certainly reflected that worldview. A Sith who argued that power belonged to the one who built it directly, not to the one who climbed for it, and who would ultimately prove the argument with his career. That is the kind of reading material a Sith Lord like Sidious would preserve. It is also the kind of reading material a figure like Vader would keep going back to, because the idea at its center was a model for how to be Sith without being owned by the structures the Sith had built around themselves. The Jedi's failure to ever solve him had now stopped being a wartime problem and become a permanent one. The Order had spent his lifetime trying to pressure him through structures he refused to use, trying to track him through networks he refused to join, trying to read him through patterns he did not fit. They had never found a way through, and the years they spent trying produced a fear inside the Order that no other Sith of any era had matched, because no other Sith had stayed unreachable for as long as he had. And then, he was gone. And the writing stayed, and the most dangerous Sith of the next era, and the era after that, took it down off the shelf and read it. The fear the Order carried about him was never about his lightsaber. It came from something they could not reach, a Sith who did not respond to any of their methods, and whose next move they could not read. Every other Sith they had faced could be answered in some way, but with Malgus, none of these answers held. And even when he was gone, the uncertainty he left behind never fully disappeared. But Malgus was not the only Sith whose story refused to end that way. Another figure once walked out of the Jedi Order, fell to the dark side, and left behind a legacy even the ancient Sith could not agree on.